Hello, you're listening to the HatchetJob.com gaming netcast. Now, if you've ever tried to learn a new skill or get better at a video game, which if you're listening to this, you almost certainly have done, then today's show is going to be very interesting. And that's because it's an interview with Dr. Tom Stafford. And Tom is a lecturer in psychology and cognitive science at the University of Sheffield. Tom has released a really interesting piece of research, and it's called Tracing the Trajectory of Skill Learning with a Very Large Sample of Online Game Players. And he did this along with a chap called Michael Dewar, who's actually at the New York Times Research and Development Lab. And Tom described Michael as, I think he said he was a big data specialist, okay? Now, why do you need a big data specialist for this research? Well, that's because it's an examination of 850,000 players of an online web game, a game called Axon, a very fast kind of clicky game. And they looked at how long people played and the high scores and breaks between plays. Because what Tom wanted to do, in his own words, is he wanted to connect how you practice with how good you get. Right? So why is it that some people do really well in a game and others don't? Is it because they're putting in too many hours or not enough hours? Is it because they're practicing too hard or not hard enough? And so that's what the interview is all about. Now, it's quite short compared to our normal shows, but it's quite punchy. There's a lot of information in there. And I think you'll be surprised by a lot of the findings. So let's join Tom as he tells us about his research.
As a psychologist, we're interested in learning, and if you're interested in learning, one of the fundamental questions is, what's good learning? Mm-hmm. How do you learn better? Because if you can learn better, you can reach better performance sooner, or you can spend less time to reach a particular level of performance. Pass your driving test with fewer lessons, for example. So we're interested in that question, and psychologists have approached this in a couple of ways. So one is you think of something that no one knows, so like an arbitrary task to, say, press buttons in a random order, and you get them into the lab and you get them to do it for an hour on day one and an hour on day two, and then you look at different practice regimes. The problem with that is it's an arbitrary, non-real world skill, and there's a limit to how often you can get those people back into the lab, because after a few hours of practice, no amount of money will convince them to come back into the lab because it's just deadly boring. Another approach is you're interested in looking at real-world expertise, real-world skills, and so you can look for people who spend thousands of hours of practicing something, sports people, musicians. The problem with that is, although you might go and find Wayne Rooney and get him to kick a ball, or you might get a classically trained violinist to play you something, you don't know what he or she did to get that good. So you know they're an expert, and you can compare them to someone who's not an expert, and we know, for example, that musicians' brains have marked changes that you can see structurally or functionally on a brain scan. But we don't know what it is about their practice particularly that allow them to get that good. And we know that the amount of practice is key and the effort you put into the practice is key. In terms of advice, we all know we can't dodge that bullet. If you want to get good, you're going to have to put in the hours. What I wanted to do was connect how you practice with how good you get. And I realized that computer games provide a wonderful opportunity to do that, because unlike kicking the football against the wall in the backyard or locking yourself in the room and practicing the violin for hours, with a computer game, every action you take can be easily recorded. And that allows us to then go back and connect for the first time someone who's totally engaged in what they're doing, practicing for many, many hours, and see how the way they practice affects how good they get. And, of course, with the computer game, they have a score. So it's also very simple to work out how good they got. The other advantage of computer games is you can have not just 30 people that you got into the lab, or in our case, 850,000 people. So it means you get to visualize in an unprecedented level of detail the learning curve and get reliable statistics on how different ways of practice affect that learning curve.
Now, there are some interesting quirks that I was surprised about when I was reading this. And so people who want to find out more, your data is freely available online for them to go through and interrogate.
Yes, it's on GitHub, so you can download the data and you can download the analysis code, which is written in a language called Python. And that means that if people wanted to do their own analysis, and it also means that if you thought we were not telling the full story, you could check our analysis and see that it really is the way we said it is. And we've presented a true picture of the patterns in the data. We're not just cherry picking.
People who are good at the accent game at the start of the process generally outperform people who do badly at the start of the process. So innate skill or suitability to the task is important.
Yes, and our data showed that very clearly, that there are some people who not only start the game better, but they learn faster. It's a sort of depressing tale in one way, that the people who have it get given more, rather than the kind of very egalitarian story that Malcolm Gladwell has emphasized with his popularization of the 10,000 hours rule.
Yeah.
And that 10,000 hours rule is from the work of a researcher called K. Anders Ericsson. And he has emphasized the role of practice in expertise, and he has done a very thorough program of research where he's looked at people who achieve world-class performance in different domains, so chess or skiing or something, and said that everyone who's world-class has at least 10,000 hours of practice. No one gets to be world-class without 10,000 hours of practice. It is a really important message, and an egalitarian message, in that it counteracts the belief that some people are uniquely talented or special. That we have a cultural weak spot for that story, that there are child prodigies or there are genes for genius. We want to know what was different about Einstein's brain. That story comes up all the time. And so it is really important to say that actually you can't just be born an expert. But our result just gave way to a wrinkle on that story, which is some of us might do 10,000 hours of practice and still not get there. Anders Ericsson has an answer, which is that you can't just go through the motions. It has to be effortful practice, and that means you can't ever get into your flow or just enjoy it. You always have to be pushing yourself. So there's some lovely results showing that if you look at elite figure skaters, people who go into competitions and do the twirls and jumps, and compare the people who are the top ranked with the people who are just below the top rank, the people in the top rank fall over a lot more in practice. They screw up. And that's because they're trying the next thing, whereas the people who don't get to the very best of the best are perfecting the thing they can do. And so there's a kind of story about failure and always pushing yourself, which is what we found in our research, was that people who screwed up early in training seemed to reach high levels of performance later on.
It was really interesting reading about this idea of exploration and
exploitation.
That's it, exploration and exploitation.
The theory I was testing was that if you are blinkeredly trying to do the best you can take the shortest route every time, you'll never discover any new shortcuts. So you're overly relying on what you already know. And learning is about exploring the space. So if you're going through town, it's a physical space and there are actual shortcuts. But if you're kicking a ball or playing an instrument, then the space you're exploring is the space of possible muscle movements you can make to do things. And so that was the intuition, that some exploration, which would be reflected in people not performing as well as they could early on, and in fact performing inconsistently, could be linked to higher performance. And that's what we found. Although, statistically it's a small effect, and what I want to do is confirm that using different analyses and ultimately using an experiment where we encourage one group to explore and show it improves their performance.
Another interesting finding in the study is that time you take between sessions, between trying to learn, can really quite greatly affect your success in the long run as well.
Yeah, that is a result that we being psychologists, we're pretty certain of from lab studies of learning and memory. So we know that people have a bias to clumping their practice together, so like cramming for an exam, and whether it's learning facts or learning skills, you benefit if you spread out your practice. And that's exactly what we found in the game data. So it's not an experiment, it's an observational study, but because we have so much data, it's quite easy to pick people who score the same initially and then look at those who, say, have their first 5 attempts and then take a 24-hour break, and those who have their first 5 attempts and then immediately go on in that same hour to have their next 5 attempts. And you can see that people who have a 24-hour break are then scoring as well on their 10th go as people who don't take a break are scoring on their 15th go. So they're getting the equivalent of an extra 50% of practice just by having a break. When I teach courses at the university and I tell the students at the beginning of the course, you'll remember things better if you spread your practice out, if you spread your revision out. Don't do it all in one day or, in 1 week at the end of the course.
Wasn't there also a stat which is that after 100 plays of the game that the rate of learning slows?
Well, the reason it's called a learning curve is if you imagine the number of times you practice, the amount of time practicing on the x-axis and the level of performance on the y-axis, we all know it increases very rapidly initially, and then it slows down. The thing in our data was because people drop out of the game. This is not a very deep game. It's a pointy-clicky, rapid-clicking game. And so fewer and fewer people play with each time, because some people play it 10 times, and then fewer people play it 11 times, and then far fewer people play it 12 times, and so on. So after 100 attempts, there's actually quite a small number playing the game that many times. And the graph of the learning curve becomes very noisy, and so it's less clear that the trend to improve is still there. But it probably is there. It's just very small. It's now starting to get lost among the statistical noise.
So do you think then if you had that you'd still see that curve with subsequent games that became more and more complex each time, for example?
I'm certain you would. So the learning curve is a kind of a scientific law, and so you find it in all sorts of domains, and it seems to continue for however many hours of practice you do. So there's a very famous study by a guy called Crossman in the 1950s, and he went to the cigar rolling factory and spoke to cigar rollers, people who make cigars by rolling them, and he, as a measure of skill, he looked at how long it took them to roll a cigar, and he found that people who'd been there 2 years were faster than people who'd been there 1 year, and people who'd been there 3 years were faster again, but not so much. But people who had been there 20 years, so had 20 years of practice, were still faster than people who've been there 10 years. So it wasn't like you learned all there was to learn about cigar rolling in 10 years. However much practice you did, you were getting better. It's just you were getting better by smaller and smaller amounts. I mean, the interesting thing as someone if you want to know about learning, is when you get to that stage, how can I unlock the next level of those small gains, which is where elite sports people are. Bradley Wiggins is almost as good as you can get at riding a bike, and then him and his team want to know how they can shave off a few milliseconds or whatever on this particular course.
Somebody like you with this research could say, well, after this many hours playing of diligent study, you should probably not worry about getting any better, because you'll have to put a disproportionate amount of effort in for those small gains.
Yeah, but see, in a competitive game, all you need to do is be a few fractions of a second faster than the other guy, and you've got him before he's got you, or you've beat him in the race. So the interesting thing about competitive games is, as you move up the levels, even though the improvements in performance get smaller, they can still be enough to put you ahead of the other guy. There's an interesting thing from psychologist studies of elite performance, that the reaction times are often not dramatically different in elite sports people, for example. So you look at the batter in cricket and you want to know, this ball is coming at them at 120 miles an hour. How do they respond in time? And it's not because their reaction times are 120 times faster than mine, when I could respond to a ball coming at 1 mile an hour probably. It's because they predict and they anticipate, and the reason they anticipate is those thousands of hours of practice.
Do you think different cultures have different attitudes to how to acquire skills?
Yes. The thing I know more about than games is probably martial arts.
Okay.
I did a lot of Japanese martial arts.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, you get a bit of an insight into the Japanese understanding of teaching. There's one model which is, understand what you're doing, explain the principles, talking teaching, which you see a lot in martial arts classes, which can go too far and can be very frustrating if you want to do something rather than talk about it. And the opposite end is a very strict, perhaps traditional Japanese martial arts teaching model, which is you don't explain anything, you just make people do things, and you make them do it again and again and again. So in karate, you get the kata, which are formalized sets of movements, and the point is you do them and you practice them for years, and if you're lucky, you'll at some point have an insight into what the movement means.
Yes.
I had a Japanese friend, and she was at school, and they did tennis lessons for 5 years of secondary school, and they would practice making the movements of knocking the ball over the net in years 1 and 2, and in years 3 and 4 they would be given a racket to hold in their hand, and in year 5 they would be given a ball so that they could knock the ball over the net with the racket. I mean, that is the model is just, you need to get the fundamental movement perfect before we're going to let you into the kind of chaos of actually trying to control a moving ball. That's an extreme end of teaching model.
When people are not playing, what's happening in the brain when that kind of information is being retained or absorbed? Or is that just too complicated a subject for this conversation?
No, I mean, it's a really fascinating subject. I mean, what we know about memory is that the brain is not like a computer hard disk or a filing cabinet. You don't just slot something in there and it's got a reserved bit of space and then you call it up and it comes out. The brain's a neural network. It stores information in an associative network where every piece of information is connected to every other piece of information, near or far. And that's why you can remember what the capital of France is, but you can also remember, if I say the place where the Eiffel Tower is, you can pull out the answer in lots of different ways because it's all in there in a network. And the consequence of storing information in associative networks is that when you learn something new, it has to be interrelated to everything you already know. And that takes time. And that's why people who have a break after learning or people who have sleep after learning retain that information better, because sleep is actually it's a bit like hard disk defragging or something. It gives you a chance to sort out the memories offline.
So do you think that if somebody were making a video game now, or they were preparing kind of a welcome pack for people who've got hired into a new job, and as part of that there's a training session, it would make sense for them to try and associate tasks in that job with everyday tasks or things that the person might have done before, so they're kind of making that connection for them, or does that not really not matter?
No, I mean that's one of the ways we learn is by associating things with what we know already, and the kind of flip side of that is what psychologists call interference, which is where you can't learn a new thing because it's too similar to something you already know, and that gets in the way. Like if a phone number that's one digit different from a very familiar one, you might frequently make mistakes when dialing. The other kind of interference is where you learn a new thing and it gets in the way of the old thing that you've learned. Psychologists are interested in those effects. It's very hard to kind of most of the time, we can't give a piece of advice about what the best way to learn is, but just kind of to be aware that you can have those difficulties as well as, make things easier by starting from what people already know. One thing I want to do that isn't quite to do with learning is looking at predicting what makes people persist. So one thing that was really obvious with our game was that people drop out at every stage. So about half as many people play twice as play once. So the most common number of attempts was 1. And obviously you don't get any learning if you just do it once. And in fact, the computer game company told me that the game takes about 3 seconds to load. And they said about half of the people who click on the link don't ever play the game. So they quit in the 3 seconds that the game takes to load in the browser, which they said is typical and tells you something about our attention spans when we're on the internet. So one of the things I want to do is apply this and these analysis techniques to predicting how game experience affects whether people keep playing. Because it would be really interesting. You would think that if you never learn, like if you're one of these people who unfortunately finds the game very difficult, you would give up. Conversely, it might be that if you learn it too quickly, there's no challenge, you also give up. So there'll be an optimal amount of challenge. And with these large data sets, you could predict that, and you could look and see what is the right amount of learning that predicts that someone will keep playing the game or keep giving it, keep having one extra attempt. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to do next.
Game designers and people that make games use focus groups and look at metrics to figure out where people are failing and how they're failing, and then they can say, was this frustrating or not frustrating? What information do you need? But I wonder if, for most game designers, that's kind of an artistic endeavor rather than a scientific one.
And their intuitions will be far superior to any statistic I could come up with, probably. But I wonder if the statistics could augment those intuitions. So game designers calibrate the difficulty, and that you can actually calibrate the difficulty yourself. Do you want to play easy, medium, or hard level? But it'd be interesting also to calibrate the rate of learning. I mean, some people, they might be very happy to learn slowly, whereas other people want big gains. It'd be interesting to nuance that idea of difficulty.
And so we come to the end of another show, and of course my thanks to Dr. Tom Stafford for coming on. I enjoyed speaking to him, and I hope you enjoyed listening to him, and like me, you learned a few things along the way. Anyway, that's it from us. If you want to follow us on Twitter, HatchetJob is our account. That's probably the best way to keep in touch with the show. Or if you want to subscribe, we've got an RSS feed up on the website. And of course, we are on iTunes. Just search for HatchetJob. And finally, as always, do your own research and draw your own conclusions.